Hello friends and welcome to my channel. Here I'm sharing my journey through watercolor wonders, so if that's any interest of you then stick around. So this week we are painting this beautiful Calla Lily. If you would like to follow along in real time, then you can join my Patreon community where I upload all full-length tutorials. And now I'm gonna walk you through the process, the color mixing and the techniques I use to paint it. So without further ado, to create this really beautiful burgundy dark red color, I mixed quinacridone magenta with some perlin maroon. Then to make it darker, I started adding phthalo blue, and to make it a little bit more royal-like color, I added some quinacridone gold. And so now I'm mixing a second mix, which I'm gonna use the same pigments for, but this time I wanted to create way darker, so I'm adding a bit more blue. And so by using the same pigments but slightly in a different quantity of each, I can create a different color, yet it's very coherent and goes well with all my mixes because I'm trying to use the same pigments to create all of my colors for the project. So I'm gonna also be using a little bit of neutral tint as my gray underlayer for those parts that you can see some gray showing through. So let's start. So usually every single painting, mostly I start by applying those base layers with wet on wet technique. But before I can do that, I see a little bit of gray showing through where a highlight sort of is, but because the flower is so dark, the highlight is quite tinted as well. So before I apply that base layer with wet on wet, I apply a very thin layer of that neutral tint color, just right where I see the highlight to be. I let it dry and then we're gonna start applying our main foundation layer. So wet on wet basically means that I'm gonna apply some clean water glaze on top of my paper first, and then I'll apply color on top of that wet layer. So try to apply water layer in a way that it's very even and evenly glistening. It does not have drying patches or puddles in order for your colors to settle very evenly. So I will start with my slightly lighter mix. So I load my brush and I try to apply on all of the flower except those highlighted gray areas that I can see showing through. So once I apply the color, I clean my brush, take the water out, and I sweep my brush through those highlighted areas where I want that gray to show through. And there's a little part right behind the leaf where the flower continues, but because the area quite small, I don't apply water there. I just painting right away. So usually when the area is bigger, I use wet on wet because it's easier to apply even layer on bigger area. But if the area is very small, there's no need for water glaze, and I start applying color right away, just like I did on those couple of places. So now we're gonna apply one more layer, same way but with our second dark mix, so that we would allow that lighter mix show through those slightly lighter areas. So again, before you apply water glaze, again you need to make sure that your first layer is completely dry, otherwise you would ruin it and smudge it. So once the water is applied, I start applying my dark color, but this time not all over the flower. I leave out some of those slightly lighter burgundy areas and cover only the darkest part of the flower. But this time I'm going down the base as well where I left it the first time, because I see the color to be the sort of more grayish dark than very bright red. So little sweeps through here and there the lighter areas to create a little bit of texture, because if you look closely at the reference photo, you can see this very nice linear texture all over the flower. So now I'm adding a little bit more blue into my darkest mix to create it way darker color and more neutral, more gray-like, because on that little part that I'm painting right now, you can see it's pretty much a pitch black there. So whenever I mix my colors and prepare like my base colors, I can always then throughout my painting just adjust it slightly by adding one or the other color for the particular area that I need, instead of just pre-mixing all those different colors in advance. So now that we have all our foundation layer on our flower head, now what we can do is focus building the darkness, the tonal values, all the brightness and the color that is very rich. Usually I build tonal values using glazing technique, meaning I use fairly watery color on dry paper. But before we do that, I would like to paint in some of those veins that are quite visible on the flower, and then we're gonna finish that texture. Once we finish with tonal values, we'll see how much of that will show through with dry brush. So now, after applying a few veins just to have a head start for all that texture that we can see, I'll start glazing and building tonal values. So when you're glazing and layering color, you want to make sure you have quite thin layers, so meaning you water them down and you have very transparent color, so that when you apply on paper, that color soaks through and soaks into the paper very well. That way it dries and you can come back and layer again and again and again, and that's how you build. And especially when you're painting something this dark, if you will start with thick colors thinking that this will get you quicker to the point where you need because the flower is dark, then what will happen is when you apply thick color on the paper, it doesn't soak through, it just sort of sits on top of the paper, and then when you want to come back to the area, apply more color, you just start smudging that color that's on the surface because it didn't soak into the paper, and then what happens, it becomes very muddy, smudged, and you can't lay a color. So the only way you can lay a pigment over and over again without getting it all muddled around is use transparent colors. So now, once we build the tonal values with those very thin layers, build the darkness to about like 90%, then we can use our dry brush technique to further enhance the color, and that way also smoothing out the surface. So that's the technique that is my favorite. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to use dry paint, still very thin color, but it's dry. I don't have much water on my brush. So when I pick up the color, I take the excess on my towel and I go with little tiny brush strokes, just dry brushing from top to bottom. And if I need to build the color, I dry brush a bit more in the darker areas, picking up slightly stronger color, and then using perhaps crosshatch technique or just little brush strokes in the direction of a form, because the flower does have a very direct form because of those lines that follow from top to bottom of that flower. And I just go and dry brush entire flower, smoothing it out, filling the tiniest gaps in the glaze in the paper, building the color, creating that really dark, nearly black burgundy color. And then when I go into slightly lighter areas, you can see those little brush strokes are a little bit more visible and textured, and I create that little bit of a texture. So now to paint the leaf, you're going to be using the same techniques. So wet on wet to apply base layer, glazing for building the tonal values, and then smoothing everything out and adding the last detail and textures with the dry brush. But before we do all of that, you can see on the leaf there are little white lighter spots all over the leaf. So in order to make things easier, I will block those spots with some masking fluid. So that masking fluid is a latex-based watercolor medium. Once applied on a paper, dries, it creates a barrier and the watercolor doesn't go through that layer, and so you can apply all your layers, all the colors, and when you're ready, you remove the masking fluid just by gently rubbing with your finger or an eraser, and then it will be white of the paper on those areas that you applied masking fluid. So to mix green color, I'm starting with lemon yellow, and I'm starting to add a little bit of a phthalo blue, little by little, because the color turns green very quickly, so don't overpower with phthalo blue. So I keep adding little by little, adjusting the tone, and I see that it's lacking some warmth. Then I start adding a little bit of Cornacton gold. So color comes pretty close, and that will be our main color for that leaf. So you see there are a little bit of darker area, so for that I'm adding a bit more blue into my already premixed green color to create slightly darker, bluer shade of green for some shadowy parts. So after making sure that my masking fluid is dry on the paper, I can apply water glaze for my foundation layer. What you want again, very evenly glistening glaze, no drying patches, no puddles. And when you tilt your head and see the light reflecting off your water glaze, if you see the texture of the paper, that's a good indication that the layer isn't too wet. So load your brush with this beautiful first lighter color and start applying all over the leaf. So the lighter color will go on most of the leaf, and the darker, more bluer color will go onto slightly more shadowy parts. So it's a very basic layer right now. You don't focus on any detail. It's just to block those two colors, and then when after this layer is dry, we're gonna start shaping the leaf, glazing, layering the color, and creating all the detail, veins, and little shadows in all those parts. So we'll do the same on the little stem, but I also noticed a little bit of more olivey green color here and there, so I'm just going to use the same pigments to mix up this color. So it was lemon yellow, quinacridone gold, and phthalo blue, but this time I'm adding a little bit more quinacridone gold to achieve that more olivey green, and I see it in few parts only. For the stem, I also apply a little bit of water just for the colors to settle nicer, and I apply my lighter green color and slightly more bluer and olivey green into my shadow side on the right hand side. So once your foundation layer is completely dry, we can water down our mixes and start glazing and building tonal value. So now I'm focusing on smaller areas at a time instead of on the leaf as a whole. And with those very transparent watery colors, I apply color mainly on a shadow part, starting to shape the veins and little shadowy parts and identifying the midrib. So basically you focus on painting the shadow parts rather than highlights. That way you bring out the form of that leaf. So because you glaze just little areas at a time instead of on a whole leaf, after each time you apply a little glaze, you clean your brush, you take water out on your towel, and you soften the edge of your glaze. So that way every layer you apply merges with the leaf without leaving any hard edges or watermarks. Once we're finished with this building tonal value with glazing process, we can let it dry completely and take our eraser and remove the masking fluid with it. So now you can see those little white bits and dots now shows through white. So now I'll pick up my smallest brush and I'm using dry paint, as you can see, and what we're gonna start doing is applying the textures, the veins, detail, and dry brushing from top to bottom in order to create more just delicious tone without leaving any hard marks, without watermarks, filling in the little gaps where it needs, and just basically just correcting the tone, adding more color, and it's like a last finishing layer, like a filter you would put on a picture just to smooth everything out. So I usually do that on all of my paintings with little brush. I go from top to bottom, and what it does, you can see, it just makes it a bit more delicious. It looks like you've been drawing with pencils, you know, because when you draw with pencils you use various techniques to blend the colors and to remove those pencil marks and make the layer look very velvety. So that's what I try to achieve with my dry brush technique. So with those very small brush strokes, I cross hatch, I move in the direction of a form, and when you do apply those very tight little brush strokes, you shouldn't be able to see the actual lines of brush strokes. It just creates that very nice and even layer. And in that way, I don't only smooth the layer by filling the gaps or just dry brush the whole hair, but also adding the lines here and there, sharpening the very little detail in the very shadowy parts, bringing out those veins and midrib. And you can see now it just gives that a little bit of oomph to that leaf with that little bit of detail. And that's it. So that is my way of painting this Calla Lily. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and if you would like a full step-by-step tutorial, please join my Patreon. And for now, I say goodbye and see you in my future videos. Hopefully you will subscribe. Bye.